Hi everyone, I'm Lindy. I know there's some names there that I'm not familiar with, so it's been a regret of mine that although you've got this great community at PFSC, that I have largely been working remotely. Um, so it's great that you've come, and I really appreciate you listening to this talk today, being able to see what I've been working on, and hopefully getting some of your expertise and feedback would be much appreciated towards the end. So today, I'll just be talking about this meta-analysis. As Alina said, it's looking at the role of parent-directed interventions and the sort of effects that they have on kids' early language development. So this is the way I've structured this presentation. Firstly, to give a little background on language delays, then talk about how we sort of suppose that parent-directed interventions might be beneficial for early language development. I'll talk about how, for the purpose of the meta-analysis, I've kind of categorized different types of parent-directed interventions. And then talk about how is language actually assessed in research, and sometimes there's overlap with how it is assessed clinically as well. I'll just give a brief overview of those types of assessments, and then I'll discuss the meta-analytic process that I undertook and also some of those results. So obviously language is very important throughout the lifespan. It can have flow-on effects to an individual's academic success, how they can participate in the workforce, and even health outcomes across the lifespan. So given that it's such an important domain in development, it's kind of alarming that so many children have various problems with language. So up to 2 of every 5 kids will experience some sort of delay. So this could be primary language delay. So this could be like developmental language disorder, or I've just with under Alina's supervision and my supervisory team been running an RCT that has a population of late talkers. So these are kids where their receptive language, their ability to understand words is fairly intact, but their expressive language is delayed. So that's some examples of primary language delay. And then with profound developmental disabilities, or something like ASD, that's what we call the second language delay. That language delay tends to be a secondary feature of those sort of primary diagnoses. And then, of course, other health-related factors can have an impact on language development as well. Low SES, there's this concept you may have heard of language nutrition. So this is just the everyday exposure to language that kids really need to thrive and develop. So oftentimes in low SES environments and families, both the quality and quantity of that language nutrition is lacking. And then, of course, other studies look at typically developing kids and how we can sort of augment their language development rather than solve any issue that they have. So I know you all know backwards and forwards what a parenting directed intervention is. So if we think about the advantages that this might have in terms of language, so we know parents are kids' earliest and best teachers. So they are the ones that will give kids the most rich exposure to early language and to that language nutrition that I was mentioning. Of course, we know if we train parents with certain techniques, unlike going to speech and language therapy, the theory behind it is that parents then will be able to use some of those language boosting strategies and up that dosage by using it day in and day out. It's the ability to use language in naturalistic settings throughout the home environment and in the social context that the child experiences day to day, really giving them the language that's geared to what they need in those contexts. And there's a potential to change the home environment as well. So simple things like having books that are accessible to kids, even if they wreck them, that just tweaking little things in the environment can be very impactful, conceivably. And the empirical evidence shows that there can be better, so this is from single studies, there can be better language outcomes through a parent-directed intervention than through no intervention, but then some limited findings even suggesting that they can be equally as effective as some methods of traditional speech and language therapy. So the way in this meta-analysis I have kind of categorized these parent-directed interventions is into these two categories. Things that are language specific, so interventions that may be something like shared reading or dialogic reading. It's all psychoeducation and skills training around how kids learn language, the mechanics of that, and skills that parents can put in place to boost the acquisition of both vocabulary and to sort of grow the complexity of language. Whereas broad-based interventions is something that covers not only language, but some other factor. So it could be something like behaviour. So we know that up to 70%, 50 to 70% of kids who have an issue with language will have a concurrent issue with behaviour. So those language-specific interventions wouldn't address that, whereas a broad-based intervention like Triple P perhaps would be able to address both these domains at the same time. So there's the way I've categorized it is that a broad-based intervention will address some other factors, not only language, whereas the language ones, of course, are more exclusive to information on that domain. Yeah, so I think I've sort of touched on these other points. I guess the last point is sometimes these broad-based interventions, so if we think of Triple P, this may be more easy to access. So of course in Australia, the governments have made this very accessible to families, the state governments. So this might be a great option if we can sort of find evidence of its utility. And it could also prevent intervention burnout. So I talked about that, that many kids will have this sort of concurrent issues with language and behaviour. That can be addressed with a single intervention. Of course, that's easier for both parent and child. Okay, so the next bit of the meta-analysis, and I know this is a lot of background, but when we get to the results, hopefully this will all come together. I sort of categorized the interventions as well by their sort of style of delivery. So are they focusing predominantly on skills training, psychoeducation, or resource provision? So of course, an intervention, there will be overlap between these. So the challenge was really to read through comprehensively the descriptions of each intervention and then sort of slot it into one of these categories, making a decision on where it predominantly fits. Then to talk about how language is assessed. So Oftentimes there'll be a clinician implemented assessment, so something like the Bailey has a language subscale, but more language specific ones are things like the preschool language scales. So these tend to have a little bit of crossover between standardized and observational. So oftentimes the clinician is making some observational assessment as part of this overall measure. Then there's parent report measures. So I've put some examples of those there. Oftentimes these capture things like expressive vocabulary or receptive language a lot better than observations do. So observations really give us indicators of expressive language, but of course we can't tell what the child is thinking and understanding. So we sometimes have a gap with that receptive language and being able to capture that in coded observations. But of course, the external validity of coded observations can't be beat. We're seeing language being used in fairly real contexts. So this was the overall question of the meta-analysis, as I've said, but then some sort of sub-questions were, okay, how do these parent-directed interventions promote language development when we look at broad-based versus language-focused interventions, by that style of intervention, or in populations that are typically developing, or those ones that have various risk factors, which I went through at the start. So this was the PICO question for this meta-analysis. So you can see we were looking at a population of kids under 6 years old. And these were the databases searched with the keywords used. So there were 2 waves of searches. So initially in July 2020, and then updated searches done just last month. So we wanted RCTs and not any of these other designs. That was our age range, kids up to 72 months. So there are papers where there's some clinician involvement, but also parent-directed, it's also parent-directed intervention, but we wanted to make sure that at least more than 50% of the intervention was geared towards the parent being the mediator of change. So for the initial search, we were also accepting clinical trials that had a treatment versus treatment design, but all of the results that you'll see today haven't synthesized those. It's intervention versus control. And also you'll see here that we retrieved all studies that had only post-test and follow-up data. So this is a scenario where perhaps a kid who's under 12 months, the parent gets the intervention then. So of course they can't be assessed on their language, and then there's only that follow-up data. Again, the results that you see today does not include any of those studies. It's just pre-post designs. So meeting the criteria as laid out here, after all this delightful screening, 98 papers met those eligibility criteria. Okay, so let's have a look at how this was addressed. So again, these are the sorts of outcomes that we had to play with. But so that we could use the most available data rather than doing a fine-grained analysis, because even within here, there's so many different types of measures. So in order to get a general sense and answer these questions, this was the approach. So I created a hierarchy both for standardized measures and for observational measures. So different tiers. If a study had pre-post data and it reported clinician implemented measure of overall language, that was tier 1. And then right down the bottom, if it only reported communication, that would be the measures selected last. So of course, for the independence of study participants, only one measure was selected for each analysis. So this is just how I sort of prioritized which was the most valuable one to select, if that makes sense. And so the same with the observational measures, sort of using the same logic that we wanted to look at the most sort of broad view of language. So this is MLU, mean length of utterance. What's the average length of the sentence that the child says? A very common sort of observational variable, all the way down to the rate. So how many words does the child say in the minute? It doesn't give us the same it doesn't give us the same sort of view of the complexity of language as MLU. So yeah, again, it was just studies. What you're seeing now is just studies with pre-post data. We just calculated an effect size for each of the outcomes. This was all synthesized in Review Manager, RevMan, using a random effects model. And with all of the graphs, it's going to be a bit tricky to see, but if you can just keep in mind for all of these forest plots, favouring the interventions on the left side versus the control. Okay, so this is broad-based versus language-specific interventions. So I know this is hard probably to see. So there were 44 studies and nearly 5,000 participants in this analysis. So broad-based had these broad-based interventions, they sort of yielded this small but significant effect, so 0.33. So this is favouring those parent-directed interventions that focus on something other than language. And so this is sort of a favourable result over the control group. Whereas the language-focused interventions yielded something that blew my mind, because you don't often see 0.00. So no significant effect of language-focused interventions. So that was quite interesting. So just to point out, you do see sort of outliers here. I just want to be clear that if I don't mention it, I've performed this jackknife sensitivity analysis on all the contrasts. And if I don't mention it, it's just nothing came up. The significance didn't change with the removal of a single study. Okay. So this is, sorry, let me just orientate myself. Sorry. So this is observational measures, okay? So this was standardized. We had this small effect for broad-based. So for observational measures, we saw a same sort of small effect that was significant for broad-based interventions, but then wholly unexpectedly for language-specific interventions, quite a large effect that was very significant. So that was quite alarming that our standardized measures would say 0.00, whereas our observational measures would say, yeah, there's a good, strong effect. Alina and I are attempting to explain these contradictory results. Different risk factors between the populations, because there's some studies just report standardized measures, some just report observational measures, and some report both. Is that an issue? Different languages of populations, year of study. Some of these are slightly older studies than in the other contrast for standardized measures. Not sure. I've checked the last two out. So human error in data entry, not that I can see. Problem with the methodology of the meta-analysis. And here I was thinking, is this what's going wrong? Is this not a good way to go, creating this sort of hierarchy? So to test that, I thought, okay, let's go more fine-grained. Let's choose one variable of standardized assessment and see what happens there. And so we get sort of the same result that we had the first time, where, yeah, it's a small significant effect for broad-based, but then not significant for language-specific. So that sort of gels with the other approach that we took. Whereas here, number of different words is our observational measure. We're getting the same sort of thing. Now, I know this broad-based one is not significant, but the jackknife analysis, if we remove one study, it suddenly is. So I don't think we can put too much credence in that. But yeah, we're finding this same sort of wacky finding where on the observational measures alone, the language-specific interventions are suddenly significant. So perhaps at the end of this talk, maybe someone will be able to weigh in or have some opinions or ideas about what might be going on there. I would be very open to hearing that. Okay, so the answer to this question, do broad-based programs, so like Triple P, have utility in promoting early language development? Like, probably. So sort of the consensus of evidence says, yeah, like it's worth looking into, whereas I don't know what's going on with the language-specific ones. Okay, so let's have a look at the intervention type. So this is the skills training versus psychoeducation versus resource provision. So when we look at it with standardized outcomes, there's insignificant effects for all of the intervention types. But doing that jackknife sensitivity analysis, if we just remove one outlier, suddenly we have a small but significant effect for predominantly skills training approaches to intervention. And the same sort of thing with predominantly psychoeducation approaches. It was sort of one outlier that was sort of driving that non-significant finding. Looking at observational outcomes, significant medium to large effects for both of these. And with the resource provision, there's just not enough studies to do that analysis, or studies reporting outcomes to have a look at that. So I guess my interpretation of this, and you can give me your views, it seems like the skills training approach is used slightly more often. There were more studies that we had. And with the outliers removed, the consensus of evidence, no matter what measure you're looking at or what type of measures, is that both approaches likely have a significant effect and can boost child language outcomes. Okay, so then the last part, or the last question to address, was sort of profiling the different risk factors. So the way that I've chosen to present this, because I literally cannot fit the graphs on screen, is to just go piece by piece. So please remember that the intervention, favouring intervention, those studies will fall on this side of the line on the left-hand side. So I will show for typically developing kids and then the other categories. First, the standardised measure, and then contrast that with what the observational measures say. So for typically developing kids, we don't see the utility of parent-directed interventions for this sort of population. And you can see there's some outliers on this forest plot, or things that seem a little bit more extreme in one direction or the other. Even when removed, that finding does not change, although the numbers, of course, change slightly. The finding of non-significance does not alter. With observational measures, so this was just a non-significant finding. You can see here there's not a lot of data to work with either. So when one of these studies is removed, there is a significant finding, but I think we need to approach that conclusion with caution. So let's have a look then at kids from low SES families. So we've got, again, it's not under the 0.05 threshold, where we would treat this as a significant finding. But again, after removing one of the studies, the significance can change. So again, just a finding to approach with caution, but that evidence as is, with everything included, is that there is not a significant effect. And then with observational findings, it's pretty much the same thing. So with all the studies included, it's just under that threshold of that p-value of 0.05. But when certain studies are removed, and actually several of these, it changes to a non-significant finding. So this is not a robust finding. My interpretation would be probably, on the whole, these measures are not effective in boosting the language of kids from low SES families. That's sort of what the consensus of evidence seems to suggest. So what about kids with confirmed or suspected ASD? So quite a few studies here to have a look at. It suggests that it might be significant, but we have the same story as we did for the kids from the low SES families. It's not a robust finding, just removing studies here and there, and the significance alters. I shouldn't say here or there, one by one, several studies, the removal of them one by one will alter the significance. And it's exactly the same picture for the observational measures. So this is sort of suggesting again that on the whole, we can't rely on these sort of interventions to affect change in those outcomes for kids with ASD as well. So what about kids with language delay? So you might be surprised that there's so few studies that were meeting all the sort of criteria to be included in this analysis. So this is where I think I will go and follow up with more analysis that just have the post-test or follow-up data as well. So on standardised measures, we can see a nice, clear, moderate, significant effect. And we've got another study included. So we've got 3 lots of data here with observational measures, and it's the same story. So yeah, of all the categories so far, if you wanted to run a study testing a broad-based intervention on a specific population, you would choose a population of kids with language delay to see if that was effective, which, thanks to Alina, is what I have done for the RCT. That's part of my PhD project. And then for kids with other health risks or issues, and so there really was a variety. This is encompassing things like preterm birth, exposure to HIV, and a range of things. It seems at first to be that there is a sort of moderate, small to moderate significant effect, but this is not robust after that jackknife analysis. And there was no analysis possible for observational measures. There just wasn't enough data. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.